All right, everybody, welcome to the Otherppl show. I'm Brad Listi, and I am in Los Angeles. Welcome. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you're all right wherever you happen to be. It is Friday, so it is time for a flashback episode where I dig into the Otherppl archives and share an outtake from an episode out of the past. Today, I'm going to be sharing an outtake from episode 762, my conversation with author and poet John Keene. Episode 762 first aired on March 9th, 2022. John Keene is a writer, translator, professor, and artist. He was a MacArthur Fellow in 2018, and his books include Annotations and Counternarratives, both of which were published by New Directions, a poetry collection called Seismosis with artist Christopher Stackhouse. He has also done a translation of Brazilian author Hilda Hilst's novel entitled Letters from a Seducer. John Keene has won many awards and fellowships, including the Windham-Campbell Prize, the Whiting Foundation Prize, the Republic of Consciousness Prize. Where is the Republic of Consciousness, incidentally? And the American Book Award. When we spoke back in 2022, John Keene was celebrating the publication of his poetry collection entitled Punks. Punks would go on to win the National Book Award for Poetry in 2022. So, a great conversation with John Keene. You'll be hearing an outtake from it in just a moment. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen. You can also subscribe on YouTube, follow the show on social media, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, and Blue Sky. You can sign up for my free weekly email newsletter over at bradlisti.substack.com. And if you want to join the Otherppl Patreon community, that would be ideal. You can do so at patreon.com/otherpplpod. Help keep this show going into the future. So today's flashback, once again, comes from episode 762. It first aired on March 9th, 2022. A reminder that the full episode is in the feed, so if you enjoy this flashback and you want to go in for the full hour with John Keene, just look for episode 762. It's there, waiting for you. So I think that's it. It's time to begin this week's flashback. Here I am back in March of 2022 with John Keene.
And the earliest version of it, I would say it might have been even 1997. It was a finalist for, or no, it wasn't even a finalist. It was at I guess it made several stages into a poetry competition. And then actually the more final version was a finalist for the Cave Canem Prize under a different name. And there were several other projects that kind of are woven into this final collection that I also sought to get published. But every time it seemed like I was going to get it published or I got, a green light of some sort, things fell through. So I actually had gotten to the point where I thought, okay, I'll never publish these poems, in my lifetime or, other than in a little chapbook that came out a few years ago from Seven Kitchens Press called Playland, which has about 15 of the poems here. But it so happened, serendipity still exists. I knew Alan Felsenthal. I'd met Alan some years ago and had followed his press. I was a big fan. I think I said to him at one point that, going to Song Cave's table at the New York Art Book Fair at MoMA PS1 was one of kind of my highlights of visiting that wonderful gathering every year. So anyway, he heard me read and he asked me if I had if the poems I read were part of a collection, and I mentioned I think the little chapbook, and then he said, well, why don't you send me the manuscript? So it actually took a couple years because when I looked at what I had, I thought, I think I had that sinking feeling that I'd had with the earlier versions of the main manuscript and several like sort of subsidiary manuscripts, which I call the kind of ghost books. But then finally, I think I was early last year, I just forced myself to go back in, revisit everything, rearrange things, and then send it to Alan and Ben Estes, the other, editor of the Song Cave. Both of them are wonderful poets in their own right. And they looked it through. They made excellent suggestions. I think, Alan may have said, the general order and the structuring of the book does work. They agreed to include the collaborative poems with Cynthia Gray, Cindy Lore, which was wonderful. I think they also said, usually, nowadays with poetry books, it's a very discrete project, but here, you have a range of poems and a range of forms, but they speak to each other, they work together. And that was something I think I realized when I began to reorder and rearrange things, that yes, this actually could work almost in a kind of symphonic way. So mixtape, anthology, symphony, you can use it in any number of terms, but that's kind of how I look at it now. And I actually feel like I'm sort of amazed when I look at it now that it's in print, to see that in fact it does work. I tell people you can read poems in any order you want, or you can start at the beginning, or you can start at the end and read backward to the front, and you get a range of sort of stories, but there are consistent themes, there's a kind of consistent arc, and you get a really sort of holistic sense of what the book is trying to do.
Okay, so a couple things come to mind as I listen to you. The first of which is that sometimes like delayed gratification can be a real blessing, because you had the ghost book, the ghost books as you call them, earlier versions, not complete, not the completed book that we now have in Punks, but elements of it that you tried to publish independently but didn't find a home for.
Right.
Do you feel a sense of good fortune now in retrospect as you consider the effect that these disparate parts have when they're working together in unison? I feel like there's a real power in this book that might not have existed might not have existed to the degree that it does had these things been published independently. Do you hear what I'm saying?
I do. One of the things I sort of feel is that, some of the poems have a kind of, I'm not talking about the poems about historical personages, right? The persona poems, but I'm thinking about the poems that, describe particular moments in time. And on the one hand, I feel like, okay, it would have been great to have those poems appear closer to the time when that they're invoking, that they're describing. On the other hand, in a very sort of strange way, though I feel like we're distant from those moments, and then in another way they're still with us, right? And so there's a power in not forgetting them, right? So it becomes a kind of project of reclamation and memory, in addition to the kind of, we think about the sort of descriptive and imaginative power that poetry possesses. So in a sense, I think the earlier books would have been very different books, but together, and of course there are many poems. I think one of the reviews, it was a beautiful review in poetry on the poetry website, and one of them noted that sort of picked up that there probably were a lot of poems that were cut. And so that's, I think, also the case, that there are many poems that, are not here that would have filled out those other books. But it's fine, because what's here is what works. And it has a particular kind of impact collectively, but also in terms of the individual poems.
So this poetry collection reads to me, or delivered an impact that is not entirely dissimilar to how I feel after I've read a memoir. And it's working more abstractly and in less of a linear fashion than the typical memoir does. But that was the feeling that I got. There was some feeling of like deep memory work, but also a feeling of completeness. There was just so much there. And I felt like I really got to know you as I read this poetry collection to a degree that distinguishes itself.
One of the things I love about poetry is that, on the one hand, you read poetry for its content. So in the sense that one thinks about a memoir, right? Yes, there are aspects of my personal life are here, right, in poetic form, right? It's not the sort of straightforward shaped narrative that you get in a memoir. On the other hand, poetry is and consists of and in language. So language is absolutely important in poetry. I mean, not all poets feel this way, but I feel this way. The language is important, right? You think about the words. Every word that goes into a poem is essential. So I think that might sort of point to the comment that you're making about abstraction, in the sense that, there is that interesting tension between what's in the poems, but also how they're told. Because how they're told, how they're written, how they unfold matters. And how they unfold individually, and then how they unfold in sections, and then how they unfold collectively. I think there is a kind of accumulative power, right? Cumulative and accumulative power to having all these poems together. I mean, I think about, for example, the poems in the section The Lost World. Those are really poems about, being a young, black, queer person, black gay man in the late 80s, early 90s, as HIV was raging, the crack epidemic was raging. We were in, kind of the throes of conservative backlash. But also, they're about being young. I mean, what does it mean to be a young person at a particular time? What does it mean to, on the one hand, have this powerful sense of freedom, and then to also feel that freedom, powerfully circumscribed in certain ways, right? Because of who you are, because of the kind of threats that are out there. So, I feel like there's a way in which that I is, of course, as always in the poem, one of the things we always say to students is, right, the I, you want to separate the I in a poem. There's a poetic speaker, a poetic voice, and then there is the author. And between the two, all kinds of things can happen, right? I think about the George Washington Carver poem. That is a poem in George Washington Carver's voice, but that's also filtered through my consciousness, right? I'm focusing on certain aspects of Carver, right? And who I imagine he is and what I imagine his significance is, right? And I wanted to think about, what might a moment in his life, a glimpse into his existence look like? And it's my glimpse, even where there's I think much more distance in terms of, what the poems are, the content of the poems, right? That authorial consciousness, a particular perspective, the aesthetics, are mine, and it connects those poems. This is why I think it's really sort of interesting to think about these poems all together. They connect to those poems that do feel much more directly autobiographical and personal.
Yeah, well, I think it's truer to life, really. When this collection has been called an exploration of the self, or the polyphonic nature of the self, which I think is accurate. And we build our identities. We build them through story. We build them through, these narratives that we construct around our memories, the stories that we tell and retell to ourselves. And we also build our sense of self from other people. We pick and choose little bits and pieces from people we admire, people we know, people we've met, people we've talked to once on a train. It could be anything, really. But that's what I think spoke to me so much about the persona section in particular, but also how it works against other sections that are operating differently. Because if it were just one of these sections alone, it would still be lovely and true to life, but not as complete as the effect that is delivered by all of these sections working in concert. So there's a unique completeness to this collection that I really appreciate.
Thank you. No, it's good to hear. I mean, as I said, I was a little worried when the book was on its way. Once you put a book in the world, you don't have any power over it. It's out there. I mean, you might do PR and, of course, clearly do readings and wonderful conversations like this. But the book is out in the world. It has to speak for itself. And I was a little nervous because I said, I think particularly after my last book, Counternarratives, people were there was a sort of expectation, where you're going to do another Counternarratives.
Which I should interrupt and just let listeners know that Counternarratives is a story collection. It's not poetry.
Exactly. It's a collection of stories and novellas. But there are ways in which that book and this book are in conversation. I mean, in direct conversation and indirect conversation, and they flow into each other. That collection, I wanted to write stories that were not at all autobiographical, but of course they're, again, shaped by my consciousness, my perspective, and they focus a lot on history. And here, of course, I think we've been talking about these persona poems and others, more personal poems about my family, particularly my grandfather and grandmother. Those have a historical weight too. But of course, everything has a historical weight, right? A historical heft here once you start to think about it. So in a sense, they're not so different as some people might imagine. But I'm glad to see the reception of Punks. And I just see people posting individual poems that really strike them, on Twitter, for example, or Instagram, is really heartening, because, I mean, people have been very moved by poems in this book. And that's what you want as a writer. You want to be able to speak to people and reach people. And sometimes you reach them in ways that you can't imagine or can't foresee, but there's something in the poem, in a story, in a novel that speaks directly to them, right? And might lift them up, or might give them a moment of recognition, or might defamiliarize the world in front of them and transform how they see things, right? Or might inspire them, right? I mean, if they're a writer or if they're not a writer, they say, oh my God, this is a poem I'm going to carry with me today, right? Or I'm going to reread this over and over because it's speaking to me in a particular way. So that's always, I think, a very encouraging thing. And I've been very encouraged by the response so far.
Well, that is the internet as God intended it to be used, right? That's when social media and the internet, like when somebody finds a poem or a piece of writing that they really respond to and they post it, that's really nice. And not only is it a really nice thing to do, but it's also nice that you as the author can often know that your work has landed, whereas previously, I guess, you would have to get a letter or maybe an email.
Yeah, right. You get sometimes you get letters. I've gotten letters, sometimes emails, but most frequently, of course, when I do readings, you do a reading and someone says, "Oh, I really, I love that story," or "That poem spoke to me," and that's as heartening as anything.
Yeah, in person.
Yeah.
Which is rarer and rarer these days. Hopefully, we're getting back to it.
in our pandemic-ridden world.
Yeah. I want to talk to you about the title of the collection, Punks, and this word punk, which I did not know until I did a little research that it was used, or it has been used, as a word for gay man.
Yes. So in Black vernacular culture, yes, if you call someone a punk, or you say, don't be a punk, or so-and-so is a punk, that can mean that they're gay. Of course, it can also mean punk, the more basic sense of, unmanly, not so much gay, but just, not strong, weak. Of course, then a punk, just about like hanging out in the corner like a bunch of punks is basically like, like bad people, outlaws. And then, of course, there was punk rock and punk music, which was big when I was young. And so I all of those things together resonated for me. So I said I would call this book Punks. And I also love that, every time when people mention this book, they have to say punks, right? Because with the various shadings implicit in it. I should say that at one point I was thinking of calling it Sissies, but I think there have been a number of books, Sissy, either titled Sissy or Sissies, and I liked Punk and Punks. To me, had, as you mentioned, this sort of these added valences that aren't always apparent. But either way, I mean, even I think in a certain way, the organization of the book is almost, in a sense, like, I don't know, like a punk song or something, right? It's like, it's not the usual, that's nice, neat. I mean, it's like, you got one poem that's basically in all caps and, is deeply informed by hip hop. And then you got other poems that are, like one of the first poems that's in couplets, right? The rhyme in couplets. So, I mean, I feel like, there's a punk spirit here, a punk in every possible, understanding of that term.
All right, everybody, there we have it. That is today's flashback, an outtake from episode 762, my conversation with author and poet John Keene. Episode 762 first aired on March 9th, 2022. If you would like to hear the full episode, you can do that. The full conversation with John Keene is available wherever podcasts are available. Just search for episode 762. It is there. You can find John Keene online at jstheater.blogspot.com. He is also on social media, Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky, and I believe Tumblr. Don't forget to subscribe to the Otherppl Show wherever you listen. Hit the subscribe button. It's free. You can also subscribe on YouTube. Follow the show on social media, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, and Blue Sky. If you would like to receive my weekly email newsletter, you can sign up over at bradlisti.substack.com. It is free. If you want to join the Otherppl Patreon community, you can do so at patreon.com/otherpplpod. Help keep this show going into the future. To sign up for the Otherppl Book Club or get yourself some Otherppl apparel, a t-shirt or a sweatshirt, head on over to the show's official website, otherppl.com. If you have a couple of minutes and you want to help me out a bit, please give this show a rating wherever you listen. Rate the show over at Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever it is. It helps the show find new listeners. I have a book out. My latest book is a novel called Be Brief and Tell Them Everything, available now in trade paperback, ebook, and audiobook editions. I narrate the audiobook. So if that sounds appealing, you can read my novel. Again, it is called Be Brief and Tell Them Everything. So coming up on Sunday, I will be in conversation with Alexandra Tanner, author of the debut novel entitled Worry, available from Scribner, one of the buzzier debuts of the spring. I had a great talk with Alexandra. She's very funny. Her book is very funny. You don't want to miss it. Stay tuned.